Kerry is a Commissioner of Children's Services in Public Health for Hackney Council. I'm not going to say anything about her speech, except that I know it's going to be incredibly powerful. But the way we're going to do it is that she will go to the lectern and she will talk and tell her story of her early life. And then we will explore it a little bit more here when she comes to sit down. Thank you, Kerry.
Thank you. So, when I started thinking about what I wanted to say here today, my thoughts would always revert back to my mum, but with it a dilemma. I've spoken about my mum before at events and even on radio, but it never stopped me wondering about the ethics of doing so. Should we really be telling other people's stories, and can we tell those stories and keep their integrity? But my mum's story is also my story, and I can't really tell one without the other. We're inextricably linked, and we always will be. So I'm the eldest of 9 children, 9 children that were taken into care. So we're one of those really expensive families. I've been the matriarch of my family since my earliest memories. At first looking after and trying to protect my mum, and then one by one my siblings. When I was 13, I watched as 6 of those siblings got taken away in several vehicles to new homes, and I stayed behind. I'd always been the one to protect them, the one to lock them in bathrooms if the house got too violent, or to lie with them at night when they were too scared to sleep. But when they all got taken away and I was left behind, everything changed, and I'd never felt so helpless. A year later, I watched as my new baby brother got taken away. A year after that, my new baby sister. I was now 14 with 8 younger siblings, and they were spread as far and wide across Birmingham as you can imagine. And up until the 7th child was taken from my mum, I stayed with her. I was deemed mature enough to make my own decisions at that point. I was 13 years old. And so I continued to watch my family being plucked from my house from the inside. And then at 14, I went to stay with a friend's family. After that, everything I knew about being a family was turned upside down and inside out, because it wasn't guaranteed that you'd stay with your mum forever. And it was no longer guaranteed, even, that you would see your siblings. You see, when your siblings are fostered, you still get to see them, but only for a few hours a week. There are 168 hours in a week, and I went from seeing my siblings 168 hours to just 2. 2 hours to love and play and be happy, all under the watchful gaze of 2 strangers in a contact centre. At Contact, I continued to try and hold the family together, but it would get harder and harder each time. And guilt started to erode me. My brothers and sisters would draw me pictures and write me letters, asking when they could come home again, and I couldn't answer them. And even worse, when your siblings are adopted, you don't get to see them at all. And my 2 youngest siblings were adopted, and I haven't seen either of them since 2001. And when I talk about this to people, I know certain assumptions are made about our family. And for some of those assumptions, you'd be right, because we were the typical family where cycles of deprivation and dysfunction passed through the generations, where poverty, neglect and violence were handed down like family heirlooms. My mum had been a child in care, and now so were her 9 children. She had been neglected and, in turn, had neglected her children. And I found myself asking, why didn't she learn from her past? Why wasn't she trying to make things better for us? Was it that she didn't want to? And that couldn't be true, because I know she has a good heart and cares about us all. So what was it? And we were the typical council estate, big family on benefits you can imagine. Yes, we were poor, and I mean below the breadline poor. Asking neighbours for food poor. And actually one of my most embarrassing memories is from about 11, when we received a letter from the council saying that neighbours had complained about us begging for food. And I was shocked. I'd never considered my actions as begging before. I just sometimes asked neighbours for food because my mum had asked me to and because we needed to eat. And yes, we were neglected. We were the family at school who constantly had nits. If you walked around our house with bare feet, they'd soon turn the soles black. My mum never did schoolwork with us at home. Risk wasn't a word I think my mum had ever heard or had any understanding of. Her awareness of risk was, and I would say still is now, non-existent. We were constantly put in risky situations. But for me, it was just the normal way of things. Because I think when you're a child, everything that you experience feels very normal. And the life I'm describing to you now, it all felt very normal at the time. And I kind of assumed that every kid I knew had some similar things going on in their lives too. So we were poor, we were neglected, and we witnessed and experienced violence. We were being looked after by my mum and a stream of interchangeable bad men. And all of those men shared the same desires of control over my mum by force, and this would sometimes spill over onto us. And one thing I realised as I got older was that my mum had very little control over her own life. All 9 children, although loved, were never planned. Pregnancy was a thing that happened to my mum because the man would decide in that moment if contraception was used or not. The man's pleasure in those moments were more important to him than anything that came afterwards, including the heartbreaking moment of having your child taken away. Does anything really show a lack of control more than knowing if you get pregnant, you're going to have your child taken away, but having no say over whether you'll become pregnant? The thing you have to understand about my mum is she has a good heart, and for the most part, she was a good mum. We were washed, dressed, and at school most days. She accepted help where it was offered, from teachers mostly and from people at church. But she was incredibly isolated, and that contributed hugely to the dissolution of our family. Her siblings and parents had very complex relationships, and they had histories of care, violence, alcohol abuse, and my mum ran away from all of that when she was 15 and continued to do what she'd always had to do, and that was to look after herself. But she'd never been prepared for it, and she'd never been prepared for starting a family. I was taken into care at 14, but I'd been on a risk register for neglect and emotional abuse from about the age of 4. So that's 10 years of social care involvement where all of the issues that my mum had continued, and over those years my mum continued to have children, and she was falling further and further into chaos. No work was ever really done with her to build her self-esteem or to really learn how to parent, or even just to be more confident with the skills that she did possess. People tend to learn from their mistakes and experiences, and most people look at ways to improve their lives and the lives of their children. This never really seemed the case with my mum. Although she always says she's proud at how well we're doing, she never really did anything to make it so. She doesn't seem to recognise the mistakes that she's made, so she never learns from them. She's accepted her lot in life, so she never challenges it. I've never seen my mum cry, and I've seen her being horribly beaten up and have all of her children taken away from her, but I've never seen her cry. And she wasn't one of those mums that said that we shouldn't cry. I've just never seen her do it. And I don't know a lot about my mum's childhood because she never really talks about it, but I know in my gut that it was a bad one. And so what I've described to you so far is a family in the throes of dysfunction and deprivation, the cycles of which we see copying as we move down the generations. A woman who was in the care system, having her children taken into care. A woman who watched her mother suffer violence at the hands of her drunken father, suffering that same violence from the partners that she chose. I think everyone would agree with me that this isn't good for anyone. It's not good for the mother, it's not good for the children, and it's not good for society. So can these cycles be broken, and if so, how? I firmly believe that they can, and I think I'm a testament of that. But I also believe if the right intervention had come along for my mum, the cycles would have been broken much earlier. And I think our family would look a lot different right now, and I truly believe would be a lot happier. A few years ago, whilst working at Hackney Council, I was asked if I wanted to help work on and set up a pilot project, which maybe a lot of you know about now. It's called the Pause Project. And I soon discovered it was a project that would work with women just like my mum. It would be an intensive programme that was working with women who had had multiple children removed from them already and were likely in the future to have more removed from them. And I remember the group right at the beginning talking about how these women are often alone trying to bring up their children but failing. They're surrounded by professionals, and eventually those children are taken away, and the mother is left on her own again. And all the issues going on for that woman remain until she becomes pregnant again. And then once again she's surrounded by professionals until that child is taken away. And once again she's left alone. So why aren't we working with those women to try and solve some of those problems before they get pregnant again? But more importantly, why aren't we working with those women to prevent more children going into care, to prevent more misery in the world? And I thought back to my life as a child and it all made sense. We'd all been surrounded by professionals trying to put things in place to make her version of parenting work. But once we were all gone, she was left to fend for herself until she became pregnant again. There was never really any ongoing work between those times to try and solve some of those issues, to prevent what was becoming a very predictable and very destructive pattern for my family. And that was actually the first time in my life that I really thought about the fact that there could have been a different path for my family. And I too, like my mum, had accepted the way of things. At the time I thought that's how the world worked, that these women were doomed to follow patterns and make mistakes and lose their children. But that's not actually the case, and it never really had to be. I think the experiences my mum had as a child meant that she would never really be cut out to be a mother without guidance and support. And I mean intense guidance and intense support. How are people supposed to know how to do something they've never been taught, or even how to do something they've only watched being done badly? I often think what would have happened if a project like Pause had been around while all of this was happening for us. Would it have worked for our family? Would my mum have become a better parent, a stronger woman? Would she have built the confidence to have a career or start relationships with good men? Would we have been allowed to go back to her? Would she have had as many children? And if not, I start to think about what it would be like not having some of my siblings. And that thought is unimaginable now. But there is one thing I think she would have gained, and that's some degree of control over her life and the ability to make her own choices. And I haven't spoken about the financial implications of this on purpose, although we all know the savings made by these women not having children taken into care versus the money spent on them being taken into care. But I really want to focus on the difference early intervention can make for people, for their lives and their futures. Not everyone gets the same chances in life. Not everyone gets the same amount of choice. I believe we have a duty to take care of those who are vulnerable, who need that extra support, who were never given the chances so many of us got, of which we built our foundations. So we can sit here and be bystanders while members of our society continue to fall through the cracks. Or we can work together to get in as early as possible, to break those cycles and give them the chances and the choices that so many of us were lucky to have. Thank you.
Well, Kerry, thank you. I said it would be powerful, didn't I? I got the chance to read it beforehand, and I always find myself kind of dumbstruck a little bit when I hear stories from people who've been through such heart-rending experiences, but one very rarely gets the chance to hear from somebody who has overcome them so amazingly. Kerry, I wondered if you could talk to us a little bit more about your mum. I was saying to you earlier that I was quite interested in how you felt about her now, but do you know much about, where some of the issues that she had stemmed from and what made her so unable to assess risk, for instance, with you and your siblings?
So my mum is a very complex creature, and I've known her for 30 years and still can't really figure her out, but I know that she has mainly had negative experiences in her life, negative with family and with friends, and mostly negative with professionals. And she grew up in care in children's homes in the 60s and 70s here. And her parents neglected and abused her. And I think one of the main things for my mum that has made it hard is that she's an incredibly isolated person. So she ran away when she was 15 to Birmingham, and I think she was, I don't know, she doesn't tell me a lot, but she was homeless for a bit, and she's always kind of fended for herself and been on her own. But there's never really been any support for her, any guidance or role models that have worked with her. And kind of my memories of my mum when I was younger is that she was a very angry and volatile person. And she would shout at people on the street who were looking at her, which was very embarrassing for me. I hated it. But she was always surrounded by men that were very violent and controlling, and I can't imagine that really gives space for my mum to grow or learn or even be happy in those environments. I think her lack of self-esteem has a huge impact on her as well, and is one of the reasons why she chooses the men that she does, or not chooses but becomes involved in. I asked her once why she was with someone who treated her badly, and she said, because she couldn't do any better. And that really broke my heart to hear that. But it gave me huge insight into who she thought she was and her worth or her lack of it. And we talked about my feelings towards my mum, because at one point I was very angry with my mum, and after she had the last baby, and we knew that it would be taken away from her in the hospital, I became very angry with her, and I didn't speak to her for 2 years because I was so frustrated that she would continue to keep having children that we would never get to know. But as I've gotten older, I don't have any ill feelings towards my mum now. I only really have sympathy for her and want to support her, because she never really had that support herself, and she was never really given any tools or support to change anything. And I think it's that lack of support and that isolation that have really contributed to who she is, or what she hasn't learned and what she hasn't become. And I think when you're that isolated and when you don't have that support, and then you have lots of experiences that are negative as a child, and then you don't have positive adults in your life, it doesn't really seem surprising to me that she had child after child taken away from her.
Yeah. When do you think it was that you started to realise that what you were experiencing wasn't okay? Because you talked about it all feeling just so very normal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it did feel very normal at the time, and I didn't really start to notice that my family was very different until I started to spend time with friends and their families, and noticing things that were different there, like there being lots of food available in the kitchen, for one, and the person that was cooking it were the parents. There were bigger things like the way that my friends' parents would react when they were angry or upset, and which didn't involve hitting with objects or screaming, breaking down. I also found a lot of solace in visiting friends, because it was a space where I got to be a child and I didn't have any responsibilities. So at home I would do the washing, I would budget, I would buy food, I would go to Tesco with £10 and try and find enough meals for 8 people for a weekend. But I was very good at maths, so I did that quite well. But until I saw families that were like that, my life felt very normal to me at the time, and even all the negative and scary experiences I had, I kind of just assumed that everybody experienced that. I didn't really think that what I was experiencing wasn't right, or was rare, or wasn't normal. But actually, realising that things in my childhood weren't okay came much later in life, actually in adulthood. So about 5 years ago, I requested my care records, and they got delivered to me, and they were about this big, a pile of papers, photocopied, not in date order, which wasn't helpful. So I did that at first, put them in order. And just as an aside, it's really weird to read about you growing up from the point of view of professionals, and even weirder to read about yourself before you have even any memories of yourself. And a nursery worker wrote about me that having learned about my family, they finally understood why I was so clingy and strange. And that was when I was 3. So, but until I started reading about that, I didn't really find out a lot about my childhood until 5 years ago. So that was quite eye-opening, a little bit upsetting. Yeah. I quite dramatically burned them all. Yeah. My housemate was having a barbecue anyway. I didn't create the fire. But I decided that I was just going to throw them in because I just didn't want to read them anymore. But I discovered a lot at that point about how the things that I had experienced weren't very normal then.
Yeah. Okay, so we'll talk in a minute about what might have made a difference, but just a little bit, can you tell me about the separation from your siblings and how that has affected all of you as a family? Because I hadn't quite realised until we spoke today just how very separate you all were.
Yeah, so it was incredibly hard. There are 9 of us, and I think for a big family it's very hard because when we all went into care, there were 9 children in 8 different homes all across Birmingham. So we were all split up, all with different people, apart from 2 of my siblings who stayed together throughout all of their care life. And even things like getting to family contact on time altogether was really hard. And if you only have an hour or 2 and you miss half of that, you hardly get to spend any time at all. And I felt a lot of guilt because I was kind of like the mum of the family already, and I held everyone together. And so when we were split up, there wasn't really anything I could do about that. And so when my siblings were starting to spiral, it was really difficult as a family who were always so used to being together and coping together to be able to support them then. And unfortunately, a lot of my siblings had very negative experiences of care, ranging from being locked in a bedroom for most of the weekend to being forced to eat powdered mustard as a punishment as a toddler, like really horrible things. And these are things that my siblings didn't tell me until years and years later. But watching them become scared and withdrawn was really difficult for me and for us all together because we'd been so used to being together and now we were so far apart and we were spending so little time together each week. And then there'd be 2 strangers there watching us, so we wouldn't talk about those things anyway. I think it would be difficult in any circumstance, but in that one, particularly difficult. And I do think it was the right decision to put us into care. I think I should have gone in actually a lot earlier, but I think it would have been better for us to be able to spend more time together. And although we knew we'd gone into care because my mum couldn't parent us, it kind of felt like we were being punished too at the time.
Yes.
And I do worry about some of my siblings even now. I worry that some of them remind me a little bit too much of my mum. A couple of them have had children very young. I don't plan on having any for a little bit longer still. I'm enjoying not looking after children at the moment. And most of them are care leavers now, but their transition from being in care to being independent, none of them were really very positive.
Right.
And you know, some of them stem back to the 90s and noughties, but one of my siblings left care last year and was kind of left to fend for himself at 18. This is still happening now, and I know that some aftercare services and some councils are very good, but it's very variable across the country, and that's really sad to hear. And I really had to push to go into higher education as well. So I did a degree, and then, so when you're in care, you get education paid for until you're 24. So I was going to milk that for all I could get out of it. So I said I'm going to do a master's as well. And I went to my aftercare worker, and she'd never had anyone that had done a master's before, so she didn't know what to do. And that was kind of sad. And she actually messed it up, and I had to defer for a year. So I did the typical millennial thing of working in a call centre for a year. But then I went and did my master's, but I read something recently, actually, that only 6% of care leavers go into higher education, compared to 40% of the rest of the population. And
that's gone up 1% then?
7% now.
Right.
That's such a huge failure for those people. And I speak to my brothers and sisters, and none of them have gone into higher education apart from one brother who has high-functioning Asperger's. He's very, very clever. And they all said similar things to what I read in this report for why they hadn't pursued that. And it was lack of encouragement, it was lack of support, and it was not knowing their options. And no one really spoke to them about that.
Yeah, well, given that one only left care last year, that's a really sad indictment of the care that they had, I'd say.
Yeah.
Let's go on to what might have made a difference. You've talked about the Pause project, and I guess a lot of people here will know about Pause. But what realistically could have made a difference to your mum earlier on? What would it have taken for somebody with that level of need to be able to parent you well enough for you to have stayed within your family? So just talking about kind of my siblings first, I think something that would have made a real difference was to
to see us as a family as a whole and not separate parts. It felt like we were very much being worked with as separate parts, and kind of interventions that we had or support we were given were inconsistent from one sibling to another. So sometimes they didn't even match up, and sometimes they were conflicting. So I think especially when it comes to siblings, seeing them as a whole and not as separate parts to be working with, if you can try and get the same people to work with them even, I know it sounds simple, but it doesn't happen. If you can do that, I think that will make a huge difference. In terms of women, so I did work with the Pause Project right at the beginning. I don't anymore. I do think it's an amazing project. I think really intensive work needs to be done with these women. So at the moment, they're working with women that have had multiple children removed from them already. I know that the idea is to move towards working with women who have only had one child removed and to get in a little bit earlier. And I think the aim really for the future is to keep trying to get in earlier and to work with people who haven't had any children removed yet, but kind of who show the signs or have the risk factors that they might have their children removed. And I think maybe a focus really needs to be on children in care and care leavers. And maybe your experience of this as professionals has been positive, but mine and my family's hasn't. When you're 18 and you leave, they kind of have been left alone to fend for themselves, to figure out kind of what their life has been about by themselves. And if you don't get your care records, you're kind of filling in those gaps. And I was doing that until I was 25. But I think the earlier that you can get in to try and stop some of those issues happening, the better it is for them, but the better it is for society as well, right?
Yes.
My mum...
Sorry, I just need to stop you there.
Yeah, sure.
So sorry, I wish we could carry on, but we do need to wrap up because we need to keep to time, although I'm sure everybody would just love to stay because I could stay for hours. Thank you very, very much indeed, Kerry. I'm sure everybody really appreciates how much you've been able to tell us about your life and about your mum and your siblings. And I'm sure everyone is hugely admiring of you as well. So thank you.
Thank you.